In this video, I'm going to give you 5 reasons why you should sell your tube amp and 5 reasons why you should keep it. Let's dive in. What's up? It's Steve. Welcome back to the channel. So today I'm going to take a look at one of those controversial topics, sort of like the nitro or relic guitar versus poly and perfect debate. Tube amps versus modeling is a big firestorm in the guitar community because tube purists believe that the tone will never be topped, that they have this vintage, nostalgic kind of feel, and there's something special, there's this it factor about them. Whereas digital modeling amps sound fake, they're too techy, they don't look great, etc., etc. Meanwhile, the digital folks believe that the technology has come so far that in most amps, especially the better ones, you can't really tell the difference between it and a tube amp. Plus, it's got all this extra stuff built in, modern features that most guitarists really want and need today anyway. Now, before we get going, I'll say this. I'm a fan of tube amps and modeling amps. Now, that's a politician's answer, but if I had to pick, I'd go slightly toward the modeling side for a bunch of reasons that I'll talk about in a second. But I want to say this, I owned a Fender Blues Junior amp for probably 20 years, and I gigged with a Vox AC15 for years, so I'm no stranger to tube amps. But in a minute, I'll dive into 5 reasons why you should get one or the other. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and like here at Steve Guitar. I've got more topics like this one, gear reviews, demos, giveaways, live looping, and a whole bunch more. All right, let's start out with 5 reasons you should sell your tube amp or buy a digital modeling amp instead of one. Here we go. Number 1, let's start out with the big one, tone. Tone is king, everybody knows that, or you're in denial if you don't. You know, if you have a killer guitar and a poor amp, your tone's not going to be very good. If you got a great guitar and a great amp and bad effects, bad pedals or whatever, your tone's not going to be really that good. And if you've recorded, if you played, you just know it when you hear a really good amplifier or a good guitar and a good feel to what you're doing. So tone is king, and that's absolutely paramount. Most tube purists believe that you can't get anything like the good old-fashioned warm tubes, especially as they heat up and turn fiery red, and you create this nice tube feel that you just can't get with a modeling amp. Now, I will say this, one of the key problems is that most guitarists play in their house, in their bedroom, in their family room, wherever it is, maybe in their back porch or whatever, and they're playing at what's called bedroom levels. The volume is so low that they're not able to crank up the tube amps. If you don't run a tube amp hot enough and big enough, you're not going to get that natural grit, that feel, the tube overdrive that often comes when you get a little bit of gain going. Now, there are pedals and tools like the JHS little black box that works like an attenuator that keeps the overall volume down while you can still crank the gain and the drive and everything, and those can do it. But for the most part, a lot of players, unless they find the right pedal or the right option, they can't really get the benefits of the tube amp. I mean, the whole point is you'd be able to crank it. But if you crank a tube amp, they're ridiculously loud, and for most players, they're impractical in their house. Now, you can debate it all day long, and leave a comment here with some pedal options to help with that problem. But for most people, they're playing in their house almost exclusively in practice. Now, if you're playing in a band or a gig, I'll say this, I've played in places before with great sound systems and speakers all over the house, mic'd cabinets, everything else. And I personally, I'm a guitarist, I've been playing for 20, 30 years, and I can't tell the difference between the tone of a tube amp in that kind of setting in a large room with a ton of extra noise, especially with people making noise if you're in a bar or whatever with drinks, and a digital one. I just think that I have a struggle telling. Now, maybe I don't have a good enough ear, maybe I'm not a tone snob or a tone purist, but if I can't tell, and I'm somewhat of a seasoned guitarist, then I think it's pretty clear that 99% of our audience here who people don't even play guitar aren't going to be able to tell either. I mean, maybe if it sounds like crap, a digital amp sounds like crap, but I just don't think people are going to be able to tell the difference. Now, that's a big one, and this is probably the heart of the debate, is tone. So in my opinion, the digital modeling amps, some of them are so good. I play the Fender Mustang GTX50, and they've gotten so good and so powerful in so many ways that, especially even Fender's Tone Master amps, which are designed to perfectly emulate, just the Fender Twin or the Deluxe or whatever. I mean, they're so close these days that I almost think you have to be just a total, tube snob to shun the digital. But again, I've got some reasons why the Tone could be better on a tube amp. All right, number 2, this one's a bit quicker, weight and size. Everybody who's owned a tube amp knows that even that Blues Junior, that small one that I had, it was like 40 pounds and it wasn't easy or fun to carry very often. Then you add in, the Fender Twin or the Bassman or whatever, or a, big old Marshall. I mean, you're talking about, 60, 70 pounds worth of weight. A ton of people have bad backs today because of that kind of stuff. They're also generally bigger because they hold, larger, not just the tubes, but the larger speakers. And so, those amps are like, this wide, that tall, and 70 pounds. Contrast that with some of the smaller digital amps, which are more compact in size. Now, if you get 212s or whatever, it's still gonna be big. But especially the size, but the weight as well. Those Tone Masters I mentioned from Fender, I mean, you can pick them up with like a pinky. And so players that have, those are getting rave reviews in particular. But I'd say size and weight is a big deal, again, especially if you're playing in your house at bedroom levels. All right, the third reason to sell your tube amp and get a digital modeling amp is effects. With my Blues Junior, I had a reverb on there. It was a spring reverb. I like spring reverb. I like to play surf music. It was a great amp for that. I thought it was so cool that I could kick the amp and hear the springs actually vibrate and shake and do that killer sort of explosive rattle. But I love hall reverb. I like delay. I like, different types of distortion and overdrive. I like flanger and chorus and all that stuff. And for some people, pedals aren't their thing, or even if you got a couple pedals, you just want that extra effect. The Fender Mustang GTX 50 that I play, for example, it's got anything you can think of. And you can set the presets, and you can lock them in, use the foot pedal, and I can go from being overdriven with a little bit of small hall reverb or small room reverb, and a little bit of crunch, one click away. I've got delay, chorus, reverb, super clean, different amp, different model, you name it. So between effects and all the different options, I mean, that's a clear winner. Some people say I don't want all that. I just want to plug into an amplifier. I know the tone I love. I got the 68 Princeton reverb and I get my nice little sound and I pump up the reverb a little bit and I'm good to go. Well, that's cool. I mean, if that's your gig, then great. But for most people, they like to play, a little bit more than just one tone all the time, whether it's crunch or surf or metal or clean or whatever. All right, number 4, maintenance. With my Blues Junior, it actually wasn't that big of a deal. I may have replaced a tube in the amp once, but I've heard plenty of stories about people who have to replace tubes too often. The tubes blow in the middle of a gig or a concert or whatever, or even at home. They don't have one, they got to figure out what to do. There's also some other issues that can come up with tube amps that maybe the digital modeling amps, which are typically, it's like a computer in a box, are more stable. But I've heard so many people say, I'm done with tube amps, I just can't stand it. I always have to take it into the shop, I gotta get it fixed, or I'm always ordering tubes and other issues. So again, it may not be the case for you. It really wasn't with me. Maybe I just got the right Blues Junior or that box I got. But for a lot of people, that's the deal killer. And number 5, connectivity. Most tube amps, especially the ones that are a bit more classic in style, again, like the old Fender Twin or the Blues Junior, I mean, you really plugged your guitar into the top of it. You didn't have a headphone output jack. You didn't have a USB. You didn't have XLRs in or out in the back. A lot of them don't have effects loops as well. So they're pretty limited. Again, they're designed to do one thing killer, and usually to run pedals in front of it and put a good microphone right in front of the speaker. So for me, I personally love the idea of having all those other options. I mean, I've got a video that talks about how to get a great killer stereo sound, especially with an acoustic guitar from an electric guitar amplifier by using the headphone output jack. I mean, I run the 1/8" headphone output right into a pair of powered monitors, right back there. And I get this nice stereo sound, especially when you add in some of those effects, stereo delay, etc. And it really opens up the whole room. So a lot of times I'm not even using the amplifier itself. Now again, the tone purists may say, well, you're never going to get a great tone out of these speakers. And I don't know that I disagree. It's just that the flexibility and the breadth of options and this ability to open up the room. Similarly, with USB, I do all my other videos here on the channel. I run the USB output right into my iPad. I use the screen recording function. I got a video on that. It's a crazy way to record killer quality without having to set up 3 mics and try to manage levels forever like that. Again, XLR stuff on the back, effects loops, other line in, line outs. Tube amps typically are far more limited than digital. Okay, so those are 5 reasons why you should sell your tube amp and get a modeling amp, or just buy a digital modeling amp right away instead of a tube amp if you've never owned either. And even though I lean that direction, let's take a look at 5 reasons why you should buy a tube amp. Number 1, tone. Just like the other debate, I think everybody would agree that tone is the most important part of any good guitar setup. And there's probably something special about the warmth of a tube amp that puts it just over the top of modeling. Maybe, maybe not. Leave a comment, tell me what you think. But what's really interesting is that tube amps really got their start, in the 1940s, 1950s type of era as part of the technology that was around for radio at the time. And it sort of blows my mind that here we are in 2020 and we're still using these glass tubes that are fragile and you shouldn't even put your fingers on them to get oil on them. Well, that's another debate. And so here we are. You'd think digital modeling amps would have fully taken over, but they haven't. But maybe it's because of some of the other reasons I'll talk about here in a second, or maybe it's just because nothing has ever matched that tone. A computer can't ever match that tone. I'm not so sure, but I will say, if you plug into a good tube amp, you're getting something, analog and authentic, and it just sometimes feels and sounds a little bit better to some people's ears. Number 2, tube amps are low tech. A lot of people say, I don't want an app to deal with or download. I don't want to have to, update firmware. I don't want to have to deal with a million effects and menu options and buttons. I want to plug in my guitar. I want to flip it on. As soon as I see that orange light or the glow start to really, kick in, I just want to rock. It's my setting. It's the same way that I left it. I don't have to save a preset. I've got my tone, my thing that I love. I can appreciate that. There's something to be said about minimalism, simplicity, and reliability for sure. Number 3, longevity. With a tube amp, there's a good chance that you could still be playing it 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. Now, you'd still have to keep up with some of those maintenance topics that we talked about earlier, but if you do, it's not going anywhere. The ones from the 50s are still as classic today and they're super sought after. I don't know that the current ones are ever going to have that type of value down the road just because, the eras have changed. But it'll still be there. And if you love it and you want to keep it, then do it. With a modeling amp, there's a really good chance that 5 or 10 years down the road, you won't even own it because they're sort of designed for obsolescence. It's just the way it is. They've got computers in them. A lot of them are dependent upon software. And of course, operating systems are changing and apps are being invented. So that's a good selling point of the digital ones. You can get the latest, greatest technology, but it's also their downfall sometimes. I have a Fender Mustang 1 amp. It's the V2, but it's the small little 1 amp. And it used a software called Fender Fuse. And a bunch of people are upset that Fender retired the Fuse software because it was a way for you to connect, via USB and manage patches and change effects and do some things that you couldn't even do on top of the amp. Well, that software is no longer supported. It's no longer out there. And as a result, there's a lot of people who, they've got bricked amps. Not completely, they could still play them, but if they want to change anything beyond what they can physically touch, they're out of luck. So I understand that. I, again, have the Mustang GTX 50, and I'm sure 5 years from now, I'll be owning a different type of Fender Mustang modeling amp instead. All right, number 4, nostalgia and looks. The old 50s amps and that type of feel back then when the Les Paul became popular, the Tele and the Stratocaster were invented. In the 60s, you know, Marshall amps, everything started to explode. You got the Beatles and Vox amps and, you know, the British invasion. You know, there's just something special about that old-timey feel. I mean, maybe you have a lacquered tweed amp. Maybe you really have a vintage one that's been, you know, beat up to death. And if you're older, you know, if you lived in the 50s, I mean, whether you're, you know, played then or grew up playing guitar, maybe your dad or granddad or whatever, mom, whoever it was, you know, had some of those old classic amps. The feel of having, you know, maybe a relict Telecaster playing through an old classic looking tube amp, there's something nostalgic about it, and that's important. And number 5, let's call it the it factor. There's probably just something special about tube amps that you really can't put your finger on. It's, you know, maybe it's a combination of all the other things we talked about, a little bit of nostalgia, some of that tube tone. You know, when you plug it in, you've been playing for a while and the amp starts to glow from behind. I mean, the fact that you can kick it and it makes some crazy rattling noise sometimes, depending on your, you know, reverb, spring reverb or whatever. It's just a cool thing to have. And, you know, a lot of people can't really explain what it is. They just love a good tube amp, and that's all there is to it. And I'll give you a bonus one, a big one we haven't talked about yet, and that is price, money. Typically, tube amps cost double, triple, or even more, you know, what a digital modeling amp goes for. The Mustang GTX 50 amp, which is a modeling amp I play, costs in the neighborhood of, you know, after a discount, $350 US. Well, if I wanted to get a Blues Junior amp, I'm probably talking about $600, $700. You know, if I wanted to get a brand new Fender Twin, you're talking about probably over $1,000. And, you know, the boutique ones get into the multi-thousands. So digital is a great option. Now, of course, if you go higher up with modeling profilers like Helix and Kemper and others, you know, you're gonna be paying a lot of money right there. But a good basic entry-level modeling amp with a ton of effects and everything, you can get one for $100, $150 US. So that right there is a giant selling point for a lot of people. Okay, so that's a look at tube amps versus modeling. Where do you come down? Leave a comment below. Tell me how you feel. Share it with the world, you know. Do you love tube amps? Do you hate them? Do you love a tube amp but you just wish they weren't so expensive? Do you think modeling amps have caught up? Do you think tube amps are old technology that should just, you know, go by the wayside? Anyway, let me know what you think, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, again, hit like and subscribe here at Steve Guitar. Check out my other guitar lessons, giveaways, live looping performances. I do more gear reviews, and I've got a bunch of tones for the Fender Mustang amps. So hope you enjoyed it, and catch you next time. See ya.